We often tell the story of the great Polynesian voyages, the incredible, seemingly impossible feats of navigation that span the vast Pacific. We focus on the stars, the wave patterns, the courage, and the discovery. And all of that is true. But for the men and women packed onto the long, double-hulled canoe, the reality of that journey was something else entirely. It was a masterpiece of monotonous, sustained endurance, a boring history of deep blue sameness. Imagine the day of departure, the cheers, the excitement, the solemn farewells, the anticipation of seeing a new land, a new world. The sails, woven from pandanus or coconut fiber, are raised. The rhythmic chants of the paddlers give way to the steady, forceful power of the trade winds catching the canvas. For the first day, maybe even the second, the adrenaline and the purpose fuel you. You're moving. You are leaving the known behind for the possible. This is the grand narrative. But now let us step onto the deck of that vaca on the third day, the fourth, the fifth. The home island has long sunk beneath the curve of the horizon, and there is nothing, absolutely nothing ahead of you except the ocean and the sky. This is the beginning of the real story. This is where the boredom, the crushing, inescapable boredom of oceanic repetition truly begins. The vaca is not a cruise ship. It is an utterly exposed, cramped, and perpetually wet existence. Most of the crew, perhaps 20 to 40 people, are packed onto the central decking, shielded slightly by a thatched cover where the navigator and high-ranking members might sleep. But the majority are sitting, perpetually damp, in the strong, persistent salt spray that coats every inch of skin, every strand of fiber, every piece of dried food. The sound is the first thing that becomes a constant, mind-numbing companion. It's the sound of the ocean, yes, but not the clean crash of a wave on the beach. It is the slosh and gurgle of water trapped between the two hulls, the insistent creak of the lashings that bind the huge logs together, and the soft, steady flapping of the sail overhead, shifting minutely with every breath of the wind. This symphony of nautical noise is relentless. It is the soundtrack to sleep, the background to work, and the rhythm of every heartbeat, making true silence impossible. It becomes so familiar that your ears no longer register the distinct sounds. They simply register the presence of noise, a heavy, unchanging blanket over the world. And what about the work? It was not a series of thrilling battles against storms. It was a slow, grinding series of chores that needed to be done every single waking hour. The most persistent, tedious task was bailing. The vaca, being built from lashed logs and fitted planks, was designed to flex, but it was never watertight. Water constantly sloshed into the hulls, adding weight and instability. Someone rotating through the crew always had to be bailing with a large calabash or coconut scoop. Scoop, pour, scoop, pour, scoop, pour. The motion is simple, the task is vital, and the water is always returning. You bail for an hour, and when the next person takes over, the water level is exactly where it was before. It is an exercise in futility disguised as necessity. Then there is the watch. The purpose of the voyage is to hold a heading, usually dictated by the stars or the rising and setting sun. The steersman must hold the immense steering paddle, or hoe, for hours on end, fighting the ocean's subtle resistance. The job is boring because the ocean rarely moves violently. It is a constant, subtle correction. 1 degree left, 2 degrees right. Hold steady. The steersman's eyes are locked on the North Star or the precise angle of the midday sun to the mast. It is a meditation on microscopic movement, a physical labor that demands intense, static mental focus. The body aches, not from dynamic effort, but from the long, unmoving strain of holding a position against the sea's slow, persistent push. The overwhelming sensory experience, however, is the color blue. The visual world contracts into an endless, circular horizon. Blue ocean meets blue sky, separated by a line that shifts, tilts, and reforms itself endlessly. The waves, no matter how large, are repetitive. The color palette of your life is reduced to the deep indigo of the water, the pale azure of the daytime sky, and the fleeting gray of passing clouds. There are no trees, no buildings, no landmarks, no changes in topography. The eye searches for novelty, for difference, but finds only the same recurring patterns of white foam and deep, monotonous blue. This visual constancy is a form of sensory deprivation. The brain, lacking new input, begins to generate its own fatigue. The boredom permeates the diet as well. The initial stocks of fresh taro and pig have long been consumed. Now the meals are reduced to the hard-dried staples: fermented breadfruit paste, which tastes vinegary and flat, and dried fish or smoked meat, which is tough, salty, and utterly uniform in flavor. Every meal tastes the same as the last. Every bite is the same texture. The joy of eating, a crucial psychological break in land-based life, is replaced by the necessity of consumption. The constant taste of salt from the spray and the food is all-encompassing, making everything blend into a single, dry, persistent flavor profile that defines your weeks. You are surrounded by people, yet you are alone. Communication is reduced to essential commands: bail, adjust the sheet, change the watch. There is little room for conversation, and frankly, little new to talk about. The journey is the same today as it was yesterday. The sky is the same. The work is the same. Your life is now a floating, creaking prison of water, wood, and repetitive labor, stretching on not for days but for weeks, perhaps for months. This is the unwritten history of oceanic monotony, and we have only just begun. The true enemy of the Polynesian voyager was not the single dramatic storm, but the slow, cumulative erosion of the self caused by constant discomfort. After a week at sea, the body ceases to be a functional, comfortable vessel and becomes a repository of persistent, low-grade pain, all thanks to the single, all-encompassing substance: salt. The canoe, the crew, and all the possessions are perpetually coated in a thick, abrasive crust of dried sea salt. This is not a dusting. It is a hardened exoskeleton that chafes and irritates every contact point. The air itself is saturated, making it impossible to truly dry out. If you manage to fall asleep, you wake to find your skin sticky, taut, and glittering under the moonlight. Your hair, caked solid, feels like rope. Your clothing, which is usually minimal, holds the salt and, combined with the motion of the hull, becomes sandpaper. The result is a catalog of injuries that are both trivial and crippling in their persistence. These are the salt sores, raw, angry patches of skin, particularly where the body meets the hard wood, or the rough deck lashing, the ankles, the small of the back, the elbows, the buttocks. Every point of contact is constantly aggravated. Every movement, every shift of position to find relief only rubs the abrasive salt deeper into the wound. There is no remedy but avoidance, and avoidance is impossible in the cramped, pitching reality of the vika. The continuous sting is a constant physical reminder of your isolation, a background static of pain that the brain eventually tires of trying to filter out. Sleep, that necessary mental and physical reset, is not available on a voyage like this. The word sleep is a misnomer. It is merely a state of temporary cessation of effort. The majority of the crew sleeps in shifts, wedged wherever a patch of relative dry deck can be found, often right next to the rhythmic creak of the mast or the insistent slosh of the bilge water. You sleep curled up, always with the fear, deep in your subconscious, that an unexpected swell or a heavy roll of the hull will send your exhausted body sliding overboard into the endless black water. The conditions for rest are miserable. The deck is hard. The air is cold from the wind funneling between the hulls. Even in the tropical latitudes, the noise is constant. True, deep restorative sleep is rare. Most of the night is spent in a kind of semi-conscious vigilance, where the mind is just alert enough to brace against a sudden lurch or to listen for the shout of the steersman. You dream not of land or food, but often of standing still, of being dry, of silence. The accumulation of sleep deficit is a slow-motion psychic fatigue, making tempers short and the repetitive tasks feel monumentally heavier than they should. The greatest source of shared anxiety, however, is not the storm, which would be a relief of action, but the slow, inevitable depletion of the fresh water supply. Water is life, and the life of the voyage is measured by the level in the massive, carved wooden casks. The daily ritual of the water ration is the most highly charged moment of the day, yet it is performed with the utmost necessary monotony. The navigator or the captain oversees the distribution. The ration is small, just enough to moisten the mouth and throat, not enough to quench the persistent thirst. It is given out in a coconut shell or a small gourd. Everyone lines up. They watch the pourer. They watch the level in the cask. This small moment of measured scarcity is when the reality of the journey becomes sharpest. The rule is rigid: one measure, once a day, and no more. This forces a psychological discipline. Every sip must be savored. Every drop that falls on the cheek is a tragic waste. Thirst is not a passing discomfort. It becomes a permanent background state of being. The mouth is always dry, the tongue feels thick, and the throat is raw from the salty air. You find yourself constantly swallowing, trying to conjure moisture. You look at the boundless ocean, the source of all your misery and all your hope, and know that it is nothing but a vast, undrinkable mirror. The crew are also keenly aware of the need to conserve every resource. When rain comes, it is a desperate, frantic scramble. Sails are lowered, or sheets of woven matting are unfurled to catch the precious, momentary deluge. Every available container, every gourd, every piece of clean fabric is used to collect the water that runs down the mast. This activity breaks the monotony, but only by replacing it with a focused, desperate burst of energy. And then, once the clouds pass, the intense, boring rhythm returns, but now with the added, monotonous duty of guarding the newly replenished supply. As the days turn into weeks, and weeks turn into the slow march toward the horizon, the concept of time begins to break down. There are no weekends, no holidays, no Sundays. There is only the cycle of the sun and the moon. The crew tracks the passage of days, not by the date, but by the depletion of the stores, the position of the stars at midnight, and the increasing stiffness in their own joints. The mind, deprived of new stimulation, the eye sees only blue, the mouth tastes only salt, the ear hears only creaking wood and sloshing water, begins to turn inward. Conversation dries up not from hostility, but from the simple fact that no one has anything new to say. The world is a 4-foot wide, 80-foot long boat. The memory of the home island, once sharp, begins to fade into a gentle, fuzzy longing. The destination, still unseen, is not a real place, but an abstract mathematical point in the sky. The monotony of the voyage is the slow, relentless reduction of human experience to its most fundamental parts. Breathing, bailing, steering, and the endless, measured wait for the next, necessary sip of fresh water. You are sailing into the unknown, yes, but for now you are merely surviving the known, repetitive moment. After the first month, the romance of the voyage is entirely gone, replaced by the grim routine of perpetual maintenance. On land, tools and equipment are resources. At sea, they are liabilities constantly fighting a losing battle against the twin forces of salt and friction. Every piece of rope, every joint, every wooden utensil needs constant, tedious attention to prevent a catastrophic failure. The lashings are the heart of the vaca. These aren't metal bolts or nails. The enormous double hull and mast are held together by thousands of feet of finely braided coconut husk fiber, called sennet. This material is tough, but the constant, subtle working of the ocean swell, the shifting, flexing, and creaking of the two hulls moving independently, continuously chafes and loosens the knots. Every day, a dedicated team must crawl over the framework, checking and rechecking the essential joints. They tighten, they resplice, they replace small sections of sennet that have frayed to the breaking point. This is work done lying flat on a pitching surface, sometimes half submerged, often using stiff, aching fingers to work tough fiber into unforgiving knots. It is labor that yields no immediate reward. It is not building something new. It is simply preventing the inevitable decay. The monotony is in the repetition of prevention. You check the same knot today that you checked yesterday, knowing that tomorrow it will need checking again. This is the definition of sustained, necessary boredom. Effort expended merely to maintain the status quo against the relentless opposition of nature. Equally tedious is the management of the sails. Woven from natural fibers, they are heavy, stiff, and prone to mildew and tearing. When a heavy squall hits, the immense sail must be lowered and secured rapidly. This is a moment of intense, shared effort, but the much more common work is the careful, slow process of repair. Finding a weak spot in the weave, carefully threading a heavy needle with thick fiber, and mending a tear while the canoe pitches and rolls. The sun beats down on your neck, your back aches from the awkward posture, and the only sound is the rhythmic, boring pull, stitch, stitch of the repair, a manual rhythm against the ocean's vastness. Then there is the essential task of food preservation. What little fish is caught must be immediately cleaned, sliced and dried on lines strung between the masts, or smoked over a tiny, carefully guarded fire pit in the central decking. The smoking fire, using precious wood, must be watched constantly, tended and nursed, to keep it burning efficiently without setting the entire boat alight. This is hours of sitting, staring at smoke, feeding tiny pieces of fuel, adjusting the smoking racks, and enduring the constant, acrid sting of wood smoke in your eyes. This watch duty is the epitome of boring necessity, absolutely critical for survival, utterly devoid of stimulation. But the most fascinating monotony belongs to the navigator, the tupuna. We celebrate their brilliance, but their method was founded on the long, slow, boring collection of minutiae. The navigator doesn't just look up at the stars at night. During the day, they are engaged in a near-constant, subtle process of listening and feeling. They track the direction of the swell, the deep, underlying pattern of the waves that travels thousands of miles. This is the primary oceanic feature that remains constant, even if the surface waves are chaotic. To read the swell, the navigator must sit or lie on the hull, often with eyes closed, allowing the rhythm and direction of the ocean's subtle push to imprint itself on their body. The difference between a South Pacific swell and a North Pacific swell might be a fractional change in period or height. The difference between a true swell and a wind-generated wave is easily confused. Hours are spent in this quiet, internal communion with the water, translating the body's subtle, repeated lurches into mental maps. This profound work is often mistaken for idleness. The navigator appears to be doing nothing, merely resting against the hull. In reality, they are performing a deep internal computation based on thousands of monotonous, identical wave movements. The boredom of the passenger, who merely feels the endless rocking, is the focus of the navigator. At night, the stars provide direction, but the clouds often obscure them. In these hours of darkness, the tupuna must rely on the memory of the wind. The wind direction, too, is monotonous. It holds a steady angle for days on end. The navigator keeps the wind on the same shoulder, knowing that if the canoe drifts too far off course, the subtle change in the air's temperature or the pressure on the sail will indicate the error. This is not dramatic heroism. It is the slow, sustained diligence of sensing a direction through temperature and sound, holding a course by feeling a steady breeze on the left ear for 200 hours straight. The true genius of Polynesian navigation was not in a single brilliant move, but in the sustained commitment to reading the same few variables, swell, wind, sun, and stars, over and over and over again, until the vaka and the body became one instrument. The boring part is the persistence. It is the commitment to observing that one wave pattern for the 5,000th time, knowing that the slight, subtle deviation it shows is the key to life, death, and landfall. The life of the voyage, then, is a master class in making the monotonous necessary, and the necessary monotonous. The monotony of the Polynesian voyage extended most deeply and least pleasantly into the daily diet. After the first stores of fresh vegetables and tubers were exhausted, the crew was reduced to a persistent, unvarying cycle of preserved food and whatever could be pulled from the water. The food was not delicious, it was merely functional, a fuel source designed for maximum preservation and minimal appeal. The mainstays were dried fish and dried taro or breadfruit paste. These rations shared a common, unappetizing profile. They were hard, dense, and required sustained chewing. They tasted primarily of salt and thyme. The texture was uniform and the flavors were muted. This was food that required effort to consume, offering little sensory reward. The act of eating became another chore, another small, repetitive task in the long, dull day. When the fishing was successful, the immediate reward was meat. But even this fresh source quickly contributed to the monotony. If a large fish was caught, a shark, a tuna, or a mahi-mahi, it was a cause for celebration. But its reality was that it provided the same protein for the next 3 days. The vast majority was sliced, salted, and dried immediately, turning the one momentary burst of flavor back into the long, chewy consistency of ration food. The crew ate to survive, not to enjoy, and the lack of variety contributed to the overall psychic dullness of the journey. The taste in your mouth was always a faint, dry saltiness, regardless of what you had just consumed. Beyond the physical discomfort, the true weight of the voyage settled in the mind, a condition best described as profound psychological isolation. Every day the crew wakes up to the same noise, the same smells, the same endless curve of the horizon. The brain thrives on novelty, on new inputs and changing environments. But the ocean provides none. The world is reduced to 3 colors: the brown of the wood, the gray-white of the sail, and the persistent, overwhelming blue of the sky and sea. This lack of change forces the mind into a slow, repetitive loop. You look at the clouds, you look at the sails, you look at the face of the person sitting across from you. You have already examined every rope, every lashing, and every knot 1,000 times. There is nothing new to see. The crew falls into silence, not because they are angry or depressed, but because they have exhausted every topic of conversation, every memory, and every shared joke from their lives on the island. Everything has been told, perhaps twice, perhaps 3 times, until the stories are as worn and familiar as the wood of the hull. The social structure, too, is dominated by monotony and familiarity. On the Vaca, there is no escape. You are always within earshot, always within sight of the same dozen or so people. Their mannerisms, their coughs, their habits, their expressions of fatigue or hunger, they all become perfectly, oppressively familiar. There is no social surprise, no new person to meet, no new dynamic to explore. The interaction is reduced to necessary functional calls. Bail, sheet in, check the lashing. The deep personal connections are forged early, but they are sustained in a silence of shared endurance, not in continuous conversation. This lack of personal space and the continuous low-grade awareness of others' presence creates an environment where small irritations, which would be ignored on land, become disproportionately significant. A sigh, a repetitive humming, the way someone chews their dried ration. These minor nuisances are repeated hundreds of times a day, chipping away at patience. The psychological defense against this is to retreat inward, to become profoundly, internally silent, a person watching the world through the slow, empty passage of the ship's wake. The ultimate source of this mental fatigue is the infinite sameness of the ocean. When land is visible, the mind can calculate and predict. When the only thing visible is the horizon, the mind is left without reference. The grand concept of the Pacific Ocean is reduced to a visual reality of endless, identical water molecules. The journey is not a line drawn on a map. It is a point of exhaustion moving through a space that refuses to change. The crew is effectively floating in a cognitive desert. To survive this mental emptiness, the body and mind must learn to be content with doing and thinking nothing new for weeks on end. They must embrace the repetitive rhythm of the boat, the monotonous task of the lashing, and the unvarying taste of the dried food. It is the slow, grinding process of making the extraordinary act of crossing the Pacific Ocean feel internally like the most ordinary, dull routine imaginable. The vastness of the Pacific is not an empty desert. It is a world teeming with life. Yet this life, paradoxically, often contributes to the overall monotony of the voyage. The sight of a whale or a school of dolphins is thrilling on day 1, but when the same species of dolphin appears every other morning for the 7th week, even wonder gives way to dull habit. Most encounters fall into the category of necessary, predictable wildlife. The flying fish are the most common and the most tedious. They are attracted by the hull light or simply misjudge their flight, landing heavily on the deck. The crew wakes to the metallic smell of them dying on the deck. The boring, repetitive job is to collect them, hundreds of small, slippery silver bodies, before they rot in the sun. This is not fishing. It is a routine harvest of a predictable resource, a chore of picking up small, twitching things every morning. The seabirds, too, are a constant, monotonous presence. They follow the vaca, sometimes for days, drawn by the scraps thrown overboard or the small fish riding in the hull's shadow. The crew becomes intimately familiar with their cries and their flight patterns. The birds are markers, living landmarks that confirm the canoe is still moving, but their presence is predictable, a background hum in the unending symphony of waves and wind. They are part of the scenery that never changes, meaning you can look up, see the same white tern, and instantly know, with crushing certainty, that you are still in the exact middle of nowhere. The true boredom of these encounters lies in the loss of surprise. You know what the ocean holds, and you know that none of it, not the birds, not the fish, not the massive dark shape of a passing manta, will change your situation or shorten the distance to land. They are interruptions, but they do not break the psychological line of the journey. To counteract the crushing weight of sameness, the crew relied heavily on ritual and routine. These repetitive acts, while boring in isolation, were the essential psychological scaffolding that prevented the mind from collapsing under the strain of infinity. Every morning began with a precise, unvarying ritual of clearing the boat. The bailing process was non-negotiable. Water always seeped into the hull, and every crew member had their station and their rhythm, scooping the bilge water out and over the side. This was boring, heavy work, done with the same carved calabash or wooden bucket day after day, but it offered a tangible sense of accomplishment. The vaca was slightly lighter, slightly safer. The ritual was more important than the task itself. It was a way of establishing control over the uncontrollable. Similarly, the evening prayer or chant was a routine of absolute importance. Whether directed at the ancestors, the gods, or the stars, the sequence of words, the tone, and the moment it occurred were always the same. It anchored the day. The vast, formless day was given structure. Before the chant, after the chant, it was a mental landmark placed in the empty time, defining the end of work and the beginning of rest. The very predictability and monotony of the ritual provided comfort and structure. The most mundane but vital ritual was the gear check. This was separate from the formal maintenance. Before settling into sleep, every member had to check their small piece of personal gear, ensuring their water gourd was secure, their fishing line was coiled, or their spare lashings were dry. This final, personal, and repetitive task served as a mental inventory. It focused the mind on the immediate, tiny space of the self and the boat, shrinking the world down from the terrifying infinite ocean to the manageable 3 square feet of one's own sleeping spot. The boring routines, therefore, were not just about sailing efficiently, they were about mental survival. The crew willingly embraced this structure, creating tiny, predictable cycles of effort and rest. It was a shared, silent agreement. We will do the same things at the same time every day, not for speed, but for sanity. The monotonous routine was the shield against the terrifying, boundless monotony of the ocean itself. In the grand narratives of great sea voyages, storms are often rendered as dramatic chapters full of heroism and terror. Yet at sea, once the initial threat is managed, the true nature of a storm is one of exhausting, miserable monotony. A great wind is not a 2-hour battle. It is often a day or more of constant, noisy, cold, wet discomfort. The crew is not engaged in thrilling maneuvers. They are engaged in the most tedious physical labor. Bailing. The hole in the vaca, boat, is not perfectly sealed. It is only slowed down. For hours on end, 2 or 3 crew members sit in the hull, scooping water with a repetitive, back-breaking motion. The air is too loud for talk, the cold too biting for comfort, and the motion too violent for sleep. The only goal is to keep the boat afloat, one scoop at a time, until the relentless, dreary rain finally ceases. A storm is not a drama, it is a high-effort, extended routine. Worse than the storm is the boredom of the doldrums, the flat, breathless, windless days. Here the challenge is not action, but agonizing inaction. The sail hangs limp, and the boat makes no progress. Every morning, the navigator checks the dwindling water supply and confirms the most discouraging news possible. They have moved 500 yards. In the heat, the crew cannot even muster the energy for repairs. They can only wait. The sky is an identical, unyielding blue dome, and the water is a mirror, reflecting the unmoving vessel. This is the deepest, most wearisome form of oceanic ennui. Waiting for the wind to shift, waiting for the world to start moving again. The work of the navigator, ostensibly the most important job of the entire trip, is also reduced to a series of tedious repetitions, methodically executed. Traditional Polynesian navigation is not a sudden flash of discovery. It is the slow accumulation of minute, unchanging data. The process of celestial observation is a daily, nightly, and profoundly boring commitment to repetition. The navigator is not looking for new stars. He is looking for the same stars, the ones he knows, the ones that mark the path to the desired latitude. Every night he watches specific stars rise and set, measuring their height above the horizon with his hand and fingers. This demands intense focus on a calculation he has performed hundreds of times before. The only difference is the minor adjustment required to confirm the vessel is still on the planned track. The wonder of the stars is gone. They are merely mathematical bright points to be cataloged and filed in the mind. The search for land signs is perhaps the most repetitive and often fruitless task. It is not a search for a distant mountain, but for extremely small, technical clues on the horizon that suggest proximity to land. This includes 1. Cloud observation. Hours spent looking for specific cloud formations, such as the Manu, cloud stacking, that reflects the light and color from nearby land, often barely visible at the edge of sight. 2. Bird flight paths, tracking the exact, identical return vector of specific land-feeding birds, like kavue or petrels, as they fly out at dawn and return at dusk. The navigator must observe the same returning vector day after day, logging the direction to pinpoint the island. 3. Wave and swell patterns, memorizing the predictable oceanic swells and looking for subtle changes in the refracted wave patterns that indicate a reef or submerged island is disrupting the flow far beneath the surface. This is meticulous, concentrated observation, not dramatic discovery. It is an intellectual endurance contest, forcing the navigator to stare at the empty, glaring blue for hours on end, looking for differences often too subtle to register. The reward for this boring focus is merely the boring confirmation that, yes, the boat is currently on the correct invisible line. The accumulation of all this relentless, unremarkable activity, the hours spent with a bilge scoop, the weeks staring at the unresponsive sea, the monotonous nightly reckoning of the same stars, achieves a singular, unintended purpose. It eliminates the need for thought. The high-stakes drama of survival is replaced by the low-grade, constant hum of maintenance. The mind, starved of novelty and challenge, ceases its frantic search for meaning and settles into a profound state of rest. This is the true skill required for long-distance seafaring. Not courage in the face of the unknown, but the ability to endure the familiar. The sailor's life becomes a series of predictable loops. The loop of the watch, the loop of the tide, the loop of the sun's arc, and the loop of the stars. The human body and mind surrender to this repetition. The eyes see without registering, the muscles move without conscious command. This prolonged state of minimal cognitive demand is what navigators often describe as the oceanic trance. In this trance, the world shrinks to the immediate dull tasks at hand. There is no time for grand speculation, no energy for anxiety, and certainly no room for excitement. The small discomforts, the damp clothes, the ache in the shoulders, the incessant creaking of the hull, blend into a single, continuous sensation, losing their power to interrupt. The mind becomes a smooth, polished stone, perpetually rinsed by the sea's unceasing, unchanging rhythms. This ultimate surrender to structural boredom is the final secret of the long voyage. The greatest achievement is not finding the island. The greatest achievement is surviving the journey not through dramatic confrontation, but through the quiet, effortless, almost vegetative endurance of relentless sameness. The Vaca is guided not by a hero's vigilance, but by the slow, hypnotic rhythm of a crew too bored to be distracted, too tired to be worried, and too deeply immersed in the endless routine to be awake in any meaningful sense. They are in essence asleep, and the boat, along with the navigator, is merely dreaming its way across the vast, empty, beautiful blue. The monotony of the sea becomes the most effective lullaby ever composed.